you guys ever noticed how we just give up before we even try sometimes? You know, an opportunity of some sort comes our way, but then for whatever reason, our mental hamster wheels, they just start spinning, and we think of a million reasons why we shouldn't do it or why we can't do it. In fact, I think it's like we have a big calculator in our minds. That, you know, that opportunity, it comes along, but then that calculator, see, it starts going to work. It's adding and subtracting and dividing and checking all the figures. And before we ever attempt to do anything, it just doesn't add up. You know, this happens in our walk with God too, believe me. You know, God is always trying to bring us new opportunities, trying to get us to live out our calling in new and powerful ways. But then that internal calculator, it starts doing the math, and more often than not, we end up in the red column. You know, it just won't work. It isn't practical. I'm not good enough for that. I'm not called to that kind of work. It's a spirit of subtraction. Now, if you think I'm up here, though, pointing fingers, believe me, I am not. I do this all the time myself. In fact, I remember quite a few years ago, this small group that I was a part of in the church I used to be a member at, they were planning this big outreach. They were going to go to the Short North Gallery Hop in downtown Columbus. Now, if you've never heard of that, basically it's this. On the first Saturday of the month, people get together and they celebrate art through the evening with new gallery exhibitions, street performers, special events, food and drinks, and it's all throughout that area there. And it's a really cool thing that they do in the community. So if you've never gone to one, I highly suggest you check it out. It's worth your while. But doing an outreach there, now that is a bit of a different story. You know, my internal calculator was working overtime from day one. You know, I thought it was a terrible idea. I mean, why would we do an outreach there? You know, it'll just make us look like those angry and ridiculous street preachers that we see all the time. You know, do we really want to be lumped into that category? I mean, what were they thinking of doing? You know, handing out these pamphlets on there with the sinner's prayer, and we're going to go up to people on the street and try to make them have a decision for Christ right then and there, you know. And I got to be honest, I even had selfish reasons for not wanting to do this outreach. You know, I hadn't been a Christian for very long, and I've got to say, it's kind of shameful to admit, but I was pretty well known around the campus party scene back in the day. So I was embarrassed. You know, I was afraid that I'd run into people that I know and that they'd think I joined some really aggressive, you know, proselytizing church or worse yet, some kind of cult. So I wanted nothing to do with it, and I was so vocal about it, I think I probably really upset our poor small group leader. You know, as I reflect on our text this morning, I must have sounded like one of the disciples here. You know, their spirit of subtraction calculators were definitely working overtime too. You know, this story, it picks up right where we left off last week. You know, Jesus, he was looking to clock out and go on his lunch break, but instead the crowds follow him. So he teaches them, he heals the sick, and then he decides he's going to test their cardio. So he goes up the mountain. You know, surely they won't make it up the mountain, right? No. Apparently, they had the same kind of workout routine and diet plan that Jesus had, because They match him and they follow him right up the mountain. You just can't get away from these people. But in all seriousness, it really is amazing to think about what this crowd must have really been like. There were men, women, and children. There were young and old, sick and healthy. There were the lonely, the confused, people struggling with addictions, foreigners, criminals, and thieves. I wouldn't be surprised, but what if, there was a murderer or two? Maybe there were some wealthy people, some religious leaders, some noblemen. So in other words, this would have been quite the crowd. So no matter who they were or whatever struggles they were facing, they made this long and arduous trek up the mountain because they were hoping that Jesus could somehow meet their needs. So when Jesus sees them, all 5,000 of them, he says lunch is going to be for everybody. Why? Because that's just what he does. He never places any limits on grace. He never draws up any boundaries on his mercies. It's for everybody. And it's without distinction. So for him, this is a big opportunity. But for the disciples, this is a big problem. Those spirit of subtraction calculators, they start buzzing and worrying and calculating. Philip does the math and his eyes probably popped out of his head. To get the kind of bread we need for this lunch break, it would cost more than we make in a year. Jesus, he must have thought that he just lost his mind. Buy bread? Doesn't he know anything about money? Doesn't he know anything about how the world works? We can't afford this. And then so Andrew, he goes around, and I'm sure he's just frantically asking everybody, do you have any extra food? So a little boy hands over 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Jesus, he comes back, he says, Jesus, this is all I could come up with. This is all we've got. This is hopeless. It's a spirit of subtraction. But then Jesus gives thanks to God for the fishes and the loaves. It's enough. Jesus knows this will be enough. Jesus has a spirit of multiplication, a spirit of abundance. And as the food is passed out among the 5,000, it is indeed enough. It is more than enough. There's enough left over for the microwave tomorrow. And this is where we get to the main theological points of all of this. God created a world of abundance. If we offer and give what we have, no matter how small or meager it is, the Lord can take it and multiply it. And because God created a world of abundance, if we share, there's always enough for everybody. So let's talk about that first point. If we offer and give what we have, no matter how small or meager it is, the Lord can take it and multiply it. Now, if faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen, then God will give us as much as we can see through that lens of faith. As an amateur astronomer and stargazer, I can think of no better example of this than Abraham. God takes him outside and shows him this vast and seemingly endless ocean of stars. And he says to him, now look towards the heavens and count the stars. If you are able to count them, so shall your descendants be. Now his calculator had to be working overtime, buzzing and worrying. That's impossible. This whole thing is ridiculous. Maybe I'm just imagining things. But then God's spirit of multiplication overrides all that negative mental programming. And he trusts God. He believes God. In the face of sheer hopelessness, Abraham has hope. And that faith is credited as righteousness. And then he becomes the father of an entire nation of people. Oh, but it doesn't stop there either. This idea of God overriding our spirit of subtraction with his spirit of multiplication. It's all throughout the Bible, both in the Old and the New Testaments, For example, Moses, he holds up his staff to God, and he says, all I have is this stupid little stick. What can I possibly do with this thing? But then God's spirit of multiplication transforms it, and he works signs and wonders through that staff. And then David, he sees a giant in full armor lumbering towards him, and all he has is a child's slingshot and a little rock. But through God's spirit of multiplication, David brings the giant down. And then the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, he said that he was weak, that he's sickly. But through God's spirit of multiplication, he traveled thousands of miles and brought thousands of people to Christ. The thing is, this calculator, this spirit of subtraction, it's always going to be running in our heads. It's always going to be crunching the numbers and telling us what we can and cannot do. It's always going to tell us that we're going to end up in the red column, whether it's a personal decision about moving to a new town or taking a new job or even if it's the work of the Lord, like going on a mission trip or starting your own Bible study in the church or just committing to spend more time in prayer every day. That calculator is always going to be there to spit out some kind of bad math. Don't do it. Just stay where you are. But like Andrew and Philip on the mountainside, like Abraham looking up at that ocean of stars, we have to let that spirit of subtraction go in faith. See, when we start to have faith in what God can do and what God can accomplish in us and through us, that spirit of multiplication is going to break through and it's going to override all of that bad mental programming that we have. That stupid calculator, it's going to start flashing warning signs. It's going to finally just explode in a big puff of smoke. Because that's the real bad math, see? What we learned today is that Jesus can work miracles with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Jesus can work miracles when the odds aren't in our favor or when things even seem impossible. That's what the spirit of multiplication is. So if you're facing a big decision in your life right now, if God's calling you to do something that you've never attempted today, or if God's asking you to do something that you never even envisioned for your life, I want you to just take it to God in prayer. I want you to hand him your 5 loaves and your 2 fish. I want you to just come to God in the beautiful simplicity of who you are and just ask him to give you that spirit of multiplication. It's all about surrender. Church, can we do this? Can we just surrender our lives to him and just trust that even with our little gifts, even with our little lives, that he can and he will do amazing things through each one of us? Brothers and sisters, let me tell you this. You are made for so much more than what these little spirit of subtraction calculators want to tell you. God created a world of abundance. If we offer and give what we have, no matter how small or meager it is, the Lord can take it and multiply it. In fact, I'm going to be so bold as to say that God needs each and every one of us at work in the world right now. Yeah. God needs us to be at work, bringing that spirit of multiplication to the multitudes in our day who need it. And that, of course, leads me to my second point. Because God created a world of abundance, if we share, there is always enough for everybody. But there's a problem with that. And I say this because that spirit of subtraction is still running in the rest of the world. That calculator with its spitting out all the bad figures and always leaving us in the red column, it is the dominant force at work in our society today. And this calculator isn't manufactured and programmed by Texas Instruments. Let me tell you, it is manufactured and programmed by the enemy. The narrative that's at work in our culture is not one of abundance, but it's one of scarcity. You know, just as Philip and Andrew couldn't see past 6 months of wages or the meager 5 loaves and 2 fish, we've been programmed to base our living on a perceived scarcity and fears of insufficiency and inadequacy. So we hoard and we save and we worry. So I'd like all of you to do some homework for me. I'd like all of you to search online for an article that's called The Liturgy of Abundance and the Myth of Scarcity by my favorite Hebrew Bible scholar, Walter Brueggemann. Now, if you don't have access to the internet, just let me know. I'd be happy to get one for you. And if you need that title again after church, just let me know. I'll give it again. And I'm serious when I say that. I think every one of us here needs to read it. And really, I think people in every church need to read it. Because in the article, he observes how most of the world's resources and wealth pour into the United States, and that as a result, money has become like a drug in our culture. We are so caught up in our own wealth that we don't even notice the poverty of others anymore. And because of that, we're less and less charitable to our neighbors. We have this love affair with the idea of more. We think we never have enough. And he says this: consumerism is not simply a marketing strategy. It has become a demonic spiritual force among us. And the theological question facing us is whether the gospel has the power to help us withstand it. It's a battle. The spiritual calculator is constantly spitting out all these bad numbers. We've seen it all over the news lately. You know, this immigration crisis, of course, it immediately comes to mind. You know, people are suffering and dying where they're from, whether it's from wars or gang violence or abject poverty. And so they're trying to come here because they see us as that shining city on the hill, and they see us as a beacon of hope. But no, we want to fence that off. We want to say, oh no, that's only meant for us. We create this insane narrative of scarcity. We don't have enough money. We don't have enough jobs. They're taking all our jobs. We don't have enough health care. We don't want to pay our hard-earned money for someone else's medical bills. We want to be so tight-fisted over those 5 loaves and 2 fish. You might as well just say you'll only get them if you pry them from my cold, dead hands. My friends, this is no way to be. As Brueggemann says, this story only ends in despair. It produces child abuse and spousal abuse. It produces indifference to the poor and the stranger that we are called to care for. It leads to the buildup of armaments and the radical divisions that we are seeing among people today. It leads to racism and environmental abuse. And I quote him again. It tells us not to care about anyone but ourselves, and it is the prevailing creed of American society. The scripture says that Jesus was testing Philip and Andrew. What if he's testing us right here, right now, in 2018? You know, are we going to close our fists and say, not from my cold, dead hands, or are we going to offer it up like that little boy did on the mountain 2,000 years ago? You see, what happened that day was a miracle. But just how that miracle happened, we're actually not sure. You know, the tradition says that once Jesus took the loaves and the fish, that he transformed them, and as they were being passed out, they just kept multiplying endlessly. And I think that's probably the view that most of us hold. But there is another version of this story. Some scholars actually suggest that what was transformed was the selfish hearts of the people. When that multitude of 5,000 saw that little boy giving Jesus all he had, they looked inside their coats and they shared the food they had with them. As the scripture says, a little child shall lead them. They came up that mountain seeking a blessing from Jesus, and instead they blessed one another through Jesus. Now I ask you, which one of these is the greater miracle? A transformation of food or a transformation of people's hearts? My brothers and sisters, that is what we need today. We need to move from a spirit of subtraction, of hoarding and coveting, to a spirit of multiplication, a spirit of Eucharist, a spirit of thanksgiving, of giving freely and with gratitude. God created a world of abundance. If we offer and give what we have, no matter how small or meager it is, the Lord can take it and multiply it. And because God created a world of abundance, if we share, there's always enough for everybody. You know, they dragged me, kicking and screaming, to that outreach. When people saw that we weren't spirit of subtraction Christians with closed fists, condemning everybody, judging everybody, people were coming by our booth left and right. And that finally broke my spirit of subtraction. They were asking us questions about God. They were asking us questions about our church. We laid hands on people and we prayed for them. We even started going into the galleries themselves and praying for the actual artists. I thought that night was doomed to failure because of my spirit subtraction calculator just pumping out all these bad numbers, but God turned it into a powerful night of abundance and blessings for that community, so much so that it became a continuous outreach ministry of the church. A spirit of multiplication leads to very different results when we smash those calculators inside all of our heads. The hungry are fed, relationships are restored, and people feel good about themselves and their neighbors. So the people coming up the mountainside in our day, let's be willing to offer up what we have, trusting that our loaves and our fish will be enough to feed these hungry multitudes and to transform our myth of scarcity into a spirit of multiplication and the abundance of God's kingdom blessings. Our God, who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, is here to feed us all. There is enough for everybody. There will even be leftovers. Amen.